Europe was burning. The deserts of North Africa were littered with twisted metal and shattered armor. Tanks that once symbolized power now sat broken and smoldering, their tracks torn, their turrets silent. In those first brutal years of the war, the battlefield was a graveyard of machines. The Germans called it Panzerfriedhof, the tank cemetery. Wherever the fighting raged, El Alamein, Tobruk, or Tunisia, the carcasses of war told the same story. Mechanical beasts born to dominate, now reduced to rust and ruin under the desert sun. But behind those wrecks lay a question the world couldn't ignore. How long could any nation keep replacing what war destroyed? Germany's answer was precision, craftsmanship, engineering, quality over quantity. But America's answer would be something else entirely. In 1942, as the Allies struggled to hold the line, nobody yet understood what was coming, that the very factories of the United States were about to turn the tide of the war. The graveyards of tanks would soon be buried under something far greater, an unstoppable flood of steel rolling from the heart of American industry straight into history.
When the United States entered the war, its army had more horses than tanks. In 1941, American armor was light, outdated, and painfully few in number. The M2 and early M3 models were clumsy, their armor too thin, their guns too weak. They looked more like relics from another age than weapons ready to face the German panzers. Reports from Europe painted a grim picture. German tanks weren't just better, they were coordinated, fast, and ruthless. Entire British divisions had been crushed in hours. The message was clear. If America wanted to win, it had to build a tank that could fight, and more importantly, a system that could build thousands of them. But there was a problem. The U.S. Army didn't have the industrial power of a tank nation yet. No mass production lines, no proven designs, and no time. Generals and engineers faced an impossible task: create a modern tank that could be produced faster than the enemy could destroy it. Factories that once made cars, tractors, and washing machines were suddenly handed blueprints for war. And as 1942 dawned, the race began. Not for the most perfect tank, but for the most replaceable one. Because America was about to prove that in a war of machines, speed could be deadlier than steel.
Across the American heartland, the nights no longer belonged to silence. The hum of machinery became the country's heartbeat. From Detroit to Cleveland, from Buffalo to Chicago, the glow of furnaces turned the skies red. Every hour, the assembly lines moved. Riveters, welders, mechanics, and machinists, men and women alike, worked in endless shifts. There were no weekends, no rest days, only deadlines that could mean life or death for soldiers an ocean away. Auto plants that once built sedans and family cars were stripped and reborn overnight. Chrysler built tank engines. Ford built armored hulls. General Motors forged treads that could crush mud, sand, and snow. A single tank wasn't just a machine. It was the product of hundreds of factories working in harmony. Steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Akron, glass from Toledo, engines from Detroit, all converging in one roaring symphony of production. They called it the Arsenal of Democracy. And it was more than a slogan. It was a revolution in how nations fought. While Germany prized craftsmanship and precision, America mastered rhythm, a pulse of industry that never stopped beating. As one worker said, wiping sweat from her face, "We don't build tanks, we build victory, one bolt at a time." The factories never slept, and neither did the dream of winning.
It began with a speech and a promise. In December 1940, before America had even entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to a nation divided by fear. He said the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy. Those words struck like a spark, and soon that spark ignited an inferno of industry. From coast to coast, factories thundered to life. Car plants retooled overnight. Steel mills expanded their furnaces. Shipyards and airfields sprawled like living cities. The rhythm of peace had been replaced by the relentless march of production. It wasn't just machines that changed, it was people. Farmers became welders. Teenagers learned to rivet. Women who had never touched a wrench now commanded assembly lines. Entire towns transformed into war machines of their own. America's economy didn't merely recover, it exploded. Every engine built, every tank assembled, every shell forged was another heartbeat of a nation waking to its power. The Germans thought America was too soft, too slow, too far removed from the fires of war. But they didn't understand the storm that was brewing, a storm of steel, sweat, and unity. By the end of 1942, the arsenal of democracy was no longer just a phrase. It was a force, louder than speeches, brighter than any promise, and soon unstoppable. If America had an engine, its heart was Detroit. Before the war, it was the city of chrome and comfort. Cadillacs, Fords, Buicks, and Packards rolling proudly off polished floors. But when the world caught fire, Detroit transformed almost overnight. The same streets that once echoed with car horns now shook under the thunder of war production. Auto plants became fortresses of steel. Designers traded sketches of luxury sedans for blueprints of tanks and armored carriers. At the Ford River Rouge complex, one of the largest factories on Earth, ships delivered iron ore at one end and tanks rolled out the other. It was industry turned into art, a living machine that could outbuild an empire. In a single year, Detroit produced more tanks than Germany could in 2. It forged engines for bombers, guns for destroyers, and parts for nearly every vehicle that rolled across Europe and the Pacific. The people of Detroit called themselves soldiers of the Second Front. Their uniforms were denim, their weapons were wrenches and welders, and their battlefield was the assembly line. Smoke hung in the air like a flag of determination. Every spark from a welder's torch was a promise to the men fighting overseas. We will not let you down. Detroit didn't just go to war, it became the war machine itself. War has always been about speed, not just on the battlefield, but in the factories that feed it. The question haunting every general and engineer in 1942 was simple. How do you replace what's lost faster than the enemy can destroy it? The answer came not from the military, but from the men who had once built America's cars. Henry Ford, Charles Sorensen, and a generation of industrial minds looked at the chaos of war and saw not destruction, but design. They broke down the tank into thousands of parts, each one standardized, simplified, interchangeable. Instead of master craftsmen, they trained armies of workers to perform one motion perfectly 1,000 times a day. A turret here, an engine there, a tread at the end of the line. Every piece moved like a note in an industrial symphony. At first it seemed impossible. A tank was too complex, too heavy, too intricate. But then the rhythm took hold. Conveyors rolled, sparks flew, and steel began to move like water.
Blueprints were rewritten for speed. Designers stopped chasing perfection, they chased production. If a part could be made faster, it was changed overnight. This was America's secret weapon, not just ingenuity, but adaptability. Where Germany built masterpieces, America built momentum. The blueprint wasn't just for tanks, it was for victory itself.
In 1941, a new design rolled out of American drawing boards, a machine that would become the backbone of the Allied war effort, the M4 Sherman. It wasn't the heaviest tank, it wasn't the thickest armored, it didn't even carry the biggest gun. But what made it great was that it could be built by the thousands. Engineers had learned from the chaos of early models. The M2 and M3 were stopgaps, awkward, rushed, and unreliable. The Sherman was different. It was built with one goal in mind: to be mass-produced. Every bolt, every plate, every curve of the M4 was designed to fit into the rhythm of America's factories. It was modular, easy to assemble, easy to fix, easy to ship. A tank that could be rolled off the line, loaded onto a ship, and land on the other side of the world within weeks. The Sherman carried a 75mm gun, a powerful engine, and enough speed to keep up with fast-moving infantry. It could be repaired in the field, rebuilt in days, and upgraded as the war evolved. Soldiers called it the best second chance a man could have, because when one was lost, another was already on the way. By the time the first Shermans reached the desert of North Africa, American commanders finally had a tank that could stand and multiply. The German officers who saw them thought the Allies had sent everything they had. They didn't yet know. This was only the beginning.
They called it the greatest mechanical miracle of the war. Inside America's vast factories, steel didn't sit, it moved. A river of molten power that flowed endlessly, forging the machines that would reclaim a continent. The assembly lines stretched for miles. At one end, raw metal, cold, silent, and lifeless. At the other, a living beast of war, an M4 Sherman ready to roll. Conveyor belts clattered. Welders' sparks flashed like lightning in a man-made storm. Engines roared for the first time as inspectors shouted above the thunder. The air was hot, oily, and alive. It wasn't just the machines that were synchronized, it was the people. Teams worked in perfect rhythm, each motion rehearsed, each second accounted for. When one shift ended, another began, and the line never stopped. At the Ford River Rouge and Chrysler tank arsenal, workers turned out one tank every 25 minutes. Not by luck, not by magic, but by organization, by sheer industrial will. Every track link, every bolt, every weld was a symbol of coordination on a scale the world had never seen before. Visitors described it as watching an army being born, an army of steel, built not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of American cities. The Germans built masterpieces by hand. America built victory by the thousands.
It sounded impossible to turn raw steel into a battle-ready tank in just 25 hours. But in 1942, at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, that's exactly what happened. Henry Ford's engineers had done what no army of generals could. They brought mass production to the battlefield. What once took months of handcrafting in Europe was now the work of a single day's labor in America. It began like a symphony. Steel plates arrived by rail at dawn. By noon, they were cut, pressed, and riveted. Engines roared on test stands by sunset. And before the next sunrise, a brand new M4 Sherman rolled out the factory doors, its treads gleaming, its turret still warmed from welding. Ford's assembly lines moved with mechanical precision. Every worker had one task, and only one:
One man drilled, another welded, a woman sealed armor seams. Together, they built tanks faster than any enemy could believe. It wasn't just speed, it was reliability. Every Sherman was inspected, tested, and shipped within hours of completion. Trains waited outside like veins of steel, carrying the machines to ports bound for Africa, Italy, and France. German intelligence refused to believe the reports. To them, tanks were masterpieces, individually crafted, fine-tuned, and irreplaceable. But America had rewritten the rules. Quantity had become a weapon. Every 25 hours, another tank was born, and with it, another reminder that industrial might could outfight any battlefield genius.
They weren't soldiers. They didn't carry rifles or march in formation. Yet every day they fought a war with hammers, torches, and endless determination. They were the factory workers, the men and women who forged the front line without ever leaving home. In Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, the clang of metal was their battle cry. The smell of oil and smoke was their uniform. They worked in heat that melted skin, through nights that never ended, driven by a purpose larger than themselves. Many had sons, brothers, or husbands overseas. Every rivet they tightened, every engine they tested, felt like one more shield protecting someone they loved. They painted names on the sides of tanks: Hell's Bell, Detroit Thunder, Iron Angel. Each one carried a piece of home into the war. There were no parades for these workers, no medals, no glory. But without them, no army could have marched, no tank could have rolled, no victory could have been won. They forged not only steel, but morale, the belief that America could build faster, fight longer, and endure harder than anyone else on earth. They didn't see the front lines, but in every sense, they were the front lines. When the men went off to war, America faced a silence in its factories. But that silence didn't last long. Into the roaring halls of steel and fire stepped the women, mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters, ready to fill the empty boots left behind. They came in dresses and aprons, and left wearing gloves, goggles, and welding masks. Hands that once held children now guided sparks that shaped the armor of victory. At first, few believed they could do it. Supervisors doubted their strength, skeptics doubted their skill. But within weeks, those doubts were gone, buried under a mountain of tanks, engines, and aircraft parts. They mastered the tools of industry. They welded seams tighter, faster, cleaner. They drove rivets with the rhythm of confidence. They learned to read blueprints like battle maps. Factories from coast to coast filled with a new sound, the high, sharp hiss of welding torches, and the laughter of women who knew they were proving the world wrong. They weren't just workers, they were pioneers. The world had told them their place was at home. Now, they were building the machines that would save it. Behind every Sherman tank that rolled into Europe, there was a woman in a welding mask, her face hidden by sparks, her legacy written in steel. Before the war, Henry Ford changed the world with one idea: the moving assembly line. Now, that same idea was about to help save it. When America entered the war, Ford's factories didn't just build cars, they built the backbone of an army. The Ford method, precision, repetition, and speed was retooled for battle. Instead of Model Ts, the lines now carried tank hulls, engines, and transmissions. Instead of leather seats,
There were bolts of armor plate and machine gun mounts. Every movement was timed, every motion measured. Where Germany handcrafted, Ford mass-produced. Where others built one masterpiece, he built 100 weapons of war. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, a factory so vast it had its own airport, Ford's engineers turned chaos into choreography. Trains delivered raw materials by the hour. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder in endless rows, assembling tanks, trucks, and bombers in a mechanical ballet of purpose. Ford once said, "You can't build a reputation on what you're going to do." And in 1942, he didn't. He built it on what he was doing, hour after hour, tank after tank, turning industrial genius into firepower. The Ford method had gone to war, and soon it would teach the world that victory wasn't just fought, it was manufactured.
It began as a dream, a factory that could take in raw materials at one end and roll out a complete machine of war at the other. That dream had a name, the River Rouge plant. Built by Ford long before the war, the Rouge was already a legend, a vast living organism of steel, smoke, and motion. But when America went to war, it became something far greater, a miracle of production. Iron ore arrived by ship straight from the Great Lakes. Coal came by rail. Glass, rubber, copper, and oil flowed into the plant like the lifeblood of an empire. Inside, the materials were smelted, pressed, molded, and forged into engines, hulls, and armor. Every hour, raw earth became a war machine. Workers joked that the Rouge could turn mud into a tank, and in many ways it could. With 100,000 workers and round-the-clock shifts, the plant never slept. From the blast furnaces to the final test tracks, it was a world unto itself, a city that lived only to build. To visiting officials and foreign observers, it was a sight beyond belief. Rows upon rows of Shermans rolled off the line like clockwork, each one fueled by American steel and the relentless will of its people. The River Rouge wasn't just a factory. It was proof that America's greatest weapon wasn't a tank or a gun. It was industry itself.
In Berlin, reports began to trickle in from spies, from submarines, from neutral ports. The stories sounded absurd. Factories in America were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Entire armor divisions, lost in one battle, were being replaced within weeks. At first, the German high command dismissed it as propaganda. No nation could build that quickly. No industry could recover that fast. It defied logic. It defied war itself. But then, the evidence arrived. Aerial reconnaissance over the North African front showed fresh Shermans gleaming under the desert sun, bearing serial numbers just days apart. From the ruins of Tunisia to the fields of Normandy, new machines appeared like they'd been conjured from thin air. Even captured tank crews whispered in disbelief. Another one already? Inside the Reich's intelligence files, the analysts tried to calculate the numbers and failed. They didn't understand the secret behind the miracle. Mass production. The same system that once built America's cars now turned out weapons by the thousands. To the German war machine, built on craftsmanship, precision, and hierarchy, the American way was madness. Crude, loud, repetitive, but unstoppable. the spies wrote home what no general wanted to believe. The Americans do not fear loss. They build faster than we can destroy. It wasn't just an army they were fighting. It was an engine of endless creation. No matter how fierce the battles grew, no matter how many tanks burned in the fields of Africa or lay twisted in the mud of Italy, the Shermans kept coming. Day after day, week after week, new convoys rolled from the ports, flat cars stacked with green steel giants, their turrets covered in canvas, their crews still learning their names. German soldiers on the front began to whisper it. Every time we destroy one, 2 more appear. What they didn't see was the heartbeat behind it all. Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, cities pounding with the rhythm of production. Sparks flying, presses thundering, assembly lines crawling like veins of steel. Men and women worked through the nights, through heat, fatigue, and rationing, driven by one belief: they would never let the front run dry. Even when bombs fell over Europe, the tide of American armor never slowed. Trains rolled through the heartland, ships crossed the Atlantic, and the factories never slept. To the soldiers who fought, those tanks were more than machines. They were proof that home had their back. To the enemy, they were something else entirely, a sign that no matter how many victories they claimed, America would answer each one with another wave of steel. The tanks kept coming, and with them, the certainty that the war's balance was shifting forever.
The Atlantic Ocean, vast, cold, and merciless. But by 1943, it had become a highway of war. Convoys stretched from horizon to horizon, merchant ships heavy with the weight of America's promise, tanks, trucks, jeeps, crates of shells, and fuel to feed an army on the move. Every wave carried steel. Every horizon shimmered with the reflection of Liberty ships. They called it the Steel Tide. German U-boats lurked below, wolf packs prowling in the depths, but even they could not stem the flood. For every ship sunk, 2 more left the docks of New York, Baltimore, and Boston. The shipyards worked without rest, men hammering under sparks and moonlight, women welding holes faster than the sea could claim them. When the convoys reached England, the ports trembled under their weight. Shermans rolled onto foreign soil, lined up in rows that seemed endless, an iron forest growing where once had been only rubble. To the British, it was salvation. To the Germans, it was dread. They began to realize the United States was not just fighting a war, it was manufacturing victory. Each shipment was another heartbeat of the arsenal of democracy. Each tank another promise kept. And as the tide rolled on, it carried with it the fate of Europe.
The sun beat down on the endless dunes of North Africa, a furnace of sand, steel, and smoke. When the Sherman first arrived, the Allies were desperate. British crusaders and American Stuarts had fought bravely, but they were no match for the German panzers. The desert belonged to Rommel's Africa Corps. Then, from the belly of Liberty ships came a new sight: M4 Shermans, fresh from Detroit's assembly lines, their olive-drab armor glinting under the African sun. Crews gathered around them in awe. They were taller, broader, and built with purpose, a machine that seemed ready to take on the world. When the engines roared to life, it was more than the rumble of machinery. It was the sound of change. In their first battles near El Alamein and Kasserine, the Shermans proved what mass production could achieve. They weren't invincible, but they were everywhere. For every tank lost to the desert, another 2 arrived by sea. For every shell fired by the enemy, America sent back 10. German tank crews began to notice something terrifying. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, the horizon would shimmer again, and out of the heat, more would come. Dust storms mixed with smoke, engines howled across the dunes, and the balance of power began to shift. In the blazing deserts of North Africa, the Sherman earned its name, not just as a tank, but as a symbol of relentless will. It was the first step in a march that would roll across continents and into history.
The Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, had seen everything war could offer. He had crushed armies, outmaneuvered divisions, and turned the Sahara into his hunting ground. But then came something new, a sound unlike any he'd heard before. Engines, hundreds of them. Across the shimmering dunes, a line of Shermans rolled forward, sunlight glinting off their armor like a moving wall of steel. Rommel raised his binoculars, expecting to count a few dozen. Instead, he saw hundreds. And behind them, supply trucks, fuel convoys, repair teams, an entire army on wheels. The kind of force that could only come from a nation that built its war machines as easily as it built its cars. Reports flooded in from the front. "More tanks are coming, Her General! Every day more!" Rommel's staff could hardly believe it. The Allies weren't supposed to recover this fast. But the Americans had rewritten the rules of war. Production was their weapon, and speed their strategy. Where the Germans built precision, America built abundance, and abundance began to win. Rommel's veterans, hardened men of the Africa Corps, watched in disbelief as the Shermans kept coming through dust and fire, refusing to stop, refusing to die. Rommel muttered to his aide, half in admiration, half in dread, "They build them faster than we can destroy them." In that moment, the Desert Fox understood the truth. He was no longer fighting just soldiers. He was fighting a nation of factories. The war had turned, and the shock of it echoed far beyond the dunes.
The desert was littered with steel corpses, tanks burned out, tracks twisted, turrets half buried in sand. In any other war, they'd have been left behind, monuments to the cost of battle. But not this time, not for the Americans. As the sun rose over North Africa, salvage crews were already at work. Mechanics, engineers, and soldiers with grease-stained hands crawled through the wrecks with determination in their eyes. What others saw as scrap, they saw as potential. They towed the hulks back to makeshift repair depots, tent cities filled with sparks, smoke, and hammer strikes. Welders patched armor, mechanics rebuilt engines, and within days, lifeless Shermans roared again. The Germans couldn't believe it. Reports came in, the same tank we destroyed yesterday is fighting again today. The Americans had turned battlefield recovery into an art form. Damaged tanks were stripped for parts, reborn again and again under the relentless rhythm of war. In some units, crews even named their revived Shermans: Phoenix, Old Faithful, Lazarus, machines that refused to stay dead. Every repaired tank was a defiance of fate, a message to the enemy. You can break our steel, but not our resolve. And so the desert began to whisper a new kind of legend, of tanks that rose from their own ashes, of mechanics who fought their own battles in grease and grit, and of an army that treated every bolt and rivet as a promise to return. Because in the war of machines, America had found its greatest weapon, not invincibility, but endless resurrection.
They weren't in the headlines. They didn't ride into glory with the infantry. But without them, the war stopped cold.
They were the frontline repair crews, the unsung heroes of the armored divisions. Wherever the Shermans rolled, these men followed, in trucks loaded with tools, spare parts, and grit. They slept in the sand beside their machines, ate from ration tins, and worked through the night by the glow of welding torches. When a tank was hit, they didn't wait for orders. They raced toward the smoke, not away from it. Under sniper fire, under artillery shells, they pulled crews from wrecked turrets, patched fuel lines, and replaced tracks shattered by mines. Their workshop was the battlefield itself, a world of dust, oil, and courage. They had no time for manuals or measurements. If a part didn't fit, they made it fit. If a tank couldn't move, they found a way to make it move. And when the engines roared back to life, the crews would cheer, climb aboard, and roll back into the fight, their mechanics watching, exhausted but proud. To the Germans, it looked like madness. To the Americans, it was routine. Because in this new kind of war, victory didn't just belong to those who fired the guns, but to those who kept them firing. They called it the Army of Grease and Guts, and though few remember their names, their work kept the war machine alive. For every tank that fought that day, a repair crew had already fought for it the night before.
War moves fast, and so did the machines that kept it running. Across the deserts of Africa and the fields of Europe, a new kind of unit rolled with the advancing armies, the mobile workshops. They looked like ordinary trucks and trailers from afar, but inside was a miracle of engineering. Lathes, welders, cranes, and forges, a traveling factory built for the front lines. Wherever a tank broke down, wherever a Sherman lay crippled by shrapnel or sand, the mobile workshops arrived like doctors on wheels. Men climbed out covered in grease and soot, armed not with rifles, but with wrenches and determination. They welded torn armor under enemy fire. They rebuilt engines in the dark. They could turn a wreck into a weapon again before dawn broke. One soldier wrote home, "We fight our war with fire and steel, and these men are the surgeons who keep it alive." The workshops became legendary. Every division wanted one. They could fix a tank, a truck, or a plane's landing gear in the middle of nowhere and send it right back into battle. To the Germans, it was baffling. How could an army move so far, so fast, and never seem to run out of working machines? The answer followed the tanks, hidden in columns of dust, rumbling behind the front lines, America's moving factories of war. They were the veins of the arsenal of democracy, carrying skill, tools, and hope to wherever the battle demanded it. And with every mile they traveled, the tide of the war moved with them.
War leaves wreckage, twisted metal, shattered tracks, burnt-out hulks. But to the Americans, that wreckage wasn't waste. It was opportunity. Across North Africa, Italy, and Europe, the U.S. Army mastered something the world had never seen before: battlefield recycling. When a tank went down, the salvage crews rolled in. They came with cranes, flatbeds, and grit, dragging the wounded Shermans, half-tracks, and trucks off the battlefield and into the waiting arms of mobile depots. Nothing was thrown away. If a hull was cracked, it was welded. If a gun was bent, it was reforged. If an engine was ruined, it became parts for 3 more. What couldn't be fixed in the field was shipped back to workshops behind the lines, or even across the ocean, where American factories rebuilt them better than before. Some tanks went through 3, even 4 lives. They'd burn in Tunisia, rise again in Sicily, and fight once more in France. Every bolt, every track link, every plate of armor was precious, not for its cost,
but for what it represented. America's refusal to waste anything that could fight another day. German commanders couldn't understand it. They had precision craftsmanship. America had industrial resurrection. Even the scrap piles of war became raw material. Steel was melted down, recast, and returned to the front in new machines of war. It was recycling at a scale never imagined. A war fought not only with bullets and bravery, but with efficiency and ingenuity. And it proved one thing above all. America didn't just win with numbers, it won with resourcefulness. Every wreck reborn was a message to the enemy. We don't run out, we rebuild.
In war, courage wins battles, but numbers win wars. By 1943, that truth echoed across every desert, every sea, and every sky. For Germany, the war had become a test of endurance. Every tank they built was a masterpiece, crafted with precision, power, and pride. But each one took time, too much time. For every Panther or Tiger that rolled off the line, America built 10 Shermans. And while the Germans obsessed over perfection, the Americans mastered production. Factories ran day and night, steel poured, sparks flew, and assembly lines moved like clockwork. It wasn't about creating the best tank, it was about creating the most. Because in the chaos of battle, a working tank today was worth more than a perfect one tomorrow. When a Sherman went down, 2 more took its place. When an entire battalion was lost, ships were already crossing the Atlantic with replacements. To the Germans, it was madness, a storm of machinery that simply never ended. They began to whisper among themselves, "They have more tanks than we have shells." And in a sense, it was true. America had turned the art of survival into a numbers game, one it was built to win. Quantity became a weapon. Every rivet, every worker, every machine that left Detroit or Pittsburgh was another step toward overwhelming force. Rommel's once proud Africa Corps found itself buried under that weight, a tide of tanks that refused to stop. In the end, it wasn't just bravery that turned the war. It was calculation, logistics, relentless arithmetic. For in this war of exhaustion, survival belonged to the nation that could outbuild the enemy. And by 1943, that nation was unmistakable.
By late 1943, the desert winds carried whispers of something impossible. Entire German divisions were vanishing beneath a tide of steel. Every time they destroyed an American tank column, another appeared, larger, louder, unstoppable. In field headquarters across North Africa, German commanders spread maps across wooden tables, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "They can't possibly replace them this fast," one officer muttered, tracing arrows across the sand-colored charts. But the reports kept coming. Fresh Shermans landing in Algiers, convoys stretching from the coast to the front, new engines rumbling day and night. Rommel himself stood silent before a ridge, binoculars fixed on a horizon crawling with tanks. It wasn't tactics or brilliance that defeated him now. It was volume. Germany's generals had built an army of masters, but America had built an army of machines. Each destroyed Sherman seemed to resurrect within days. Each battle they thought decisive only marked the arrival of more reinforcements than they could imagine. When captured American manuals and factory blueprints were studied, German engineers stared in disbelief. "They build a tank the way we build a truck," one said, almost in awe. The Luftwaffe reported sightings of endless convoys, rail lines packed with armor, shipyards launching vessels faster than they could be sunk. For the first time, German officers began to realize that they were not fighting another army. They were fighting an entire economy. It was a machine that never slept, a nation that could turn raw steel into victory faster than any strategist could react. And as the endless waves of American armor rolled forward, one chilling truth became clear to them all. No matter how brilliant their plans, no matter how fierce their defense, they could not outthink what they could not outbuild.
Winter, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were silent until they erupted. Out of the fog came the thunder of German armor, Tiger tanks, Panthers, artillery fire tearing through the snow. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Hitler's last desperate gamble. The front shattered, American lines bent and buckled. Entire units were overrun, and for a moment, it seemed the tide had turned again. Shermans burned in the snow, black smoke twisting into the white sky. Frozen soldiers dug in, their supplies thin, their hope thinner. But behind them, far behind them, the factories of America were already awake. Detroit didn't sleep that winter, nor did Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Chicago. Steel clanged, welders sparked, and trains loaded with parts screamed eastward. For every tank that burned in Belgium, 2 were already being built. For every gun destroyed, a new one was packed and shipped. Within days, replacement tanks began rolling off the ships. Crews still smelled the salt of the Atlantic on their armor as they drove straight to the front. The German commanders couldn't comprehend it. Their carefully calculated offensives were collapsing under a flood of reinforcements. The Allies had bled, yes, but they never ran dry. And when the snow finally melted, the hills of the Ardennes were once again filled with the sound of engines, Shermans, trucks, bulldozers, an army rebuilt in record time. Germany had thrown everything it had into the fire. America simply built more. The Ardennes burned, but from the ashes, the replacements arrived. And with them came a truth no general could deny. You can destroy an army, but you cannot destroy a nation of builders.
The front lines burned. Cities turned to ash. But behind the smoke of battle, another fire raged, the fire of industry. From the heart of America, steel mills glowed red against the night sky. The ground shook under the weight of production, a rhythm faster than any enemy could destroy. Every time German artillery shattered a Sherman, somewhere in Detroit, a new one rolled off the line. Every time a factory in Europe fell silent, 1,000 American machines started humming. It was a race, fire versus factory, and the factories were winning. At Ford's Willow Run plant, workers assembled a bomber every 63 minutes. At Chrysler and General Motors, tank hulls slid down the line like automobiles. Welders, riveters, and machinists worked in shifts so relentless the lights in the factories never went dark. When enemy bombers struck at supply depots overseas, America didn't mourn the loss, it simply replaced it. Shipyards along the coasts launched Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Engine plants produced replacements before the old ones cooled. To German intelligence, it made no sense. They calculated, they mapped, they tried to predict when the American machine would slow, but it never did. The arsenal of democracy had become something more, a living, breathing force. Its heartbeat was the hammer, its breath the hiss of steam and sparks. Factories faster than fire, that was America's answer to destruction. While cities burned, the forges burned brighter. And as long as the furnaces roared, the tanks, planes, and guns kept coming. Unstoppable, unending, unyielding. The enemy fought with precision. America fought with momentum. And momentum, once unleashed, cannot be bombed, burned, or broken.
Victory in modern war wasn't just won by courage, it was delivered. Across oceans and continents, America built something the world had never seen before, an endless supply chain. From the factories of Detroit and Chicago, to the docks of New York and Boston, to the beaches of Normandy and the fields of France, a river of machines, fuel, and ammunition never stopped flowing. Ships crossed the Atlantic in vast convoys, their decks stacked high with tanks, trucks, and crates of shells. Behind them came more, waves upon waves, each carrying the lifeblood of war. In England, ports thundered with cranes and engines. Warehouses overflowed with replacement parts. Trains rumbled through the countryside, hauling armor east toward the front. Then came the Red Ball Express, a roaring artery of trucks, thundering from the French coast to the front lines without rest. Day and night they drove. Gasoline, food, ammunition, all flowing in a ceaseless loop. Drivers slept in their seats. Mechanics repaired engines on the move. And still, the line never stopped. German generals couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their supply lines were shattered by Allied bombers, yet the Americans seemed infinite, self-healing, self-sustaining, unstoppable. It was logistics turned into warfare. An army of drivers, loaders, and engineers that fought not with guns, but with motion. For every Sherman that needed fuel, it arrived. For every infantryman who ran out of rounds, ammunition was already waiting. The endless supply chain was more than transport. It was the nervous system of victory. And when history looked back, it became clear. The war wasn't only won on the battlefield. It was won on the road, on the sea, and on the factory floor by the men and women who kept the chain unbroken.
In the age of knights and muskets, wars were decided by strategy, courage, and chance. But by the 1940s, victory was decided by industry. This was the true face of modern war. Machines fighting machines, and nations racing to outbuild, outproduce, and outlast. The United States turned its factories into fortresses. Steel mills roared day and night. Rivers of molten metal poured into molds, becoming tanks, guns, bombers, and ships. Every assembly line was a front line. Every factory worker a soldier without a rifle. Across the nation, men, women, and even teenagers joined the war of production. They measured success not in medals, but in output. Every hour, more engines. Every day, more bombers. Every week, more tanks. In 1 month, America built more aircraft than Germany could in 3. Factories that once made cars now forged armor. Those that made typewriters now stamped gun parts. Detroit became the heart of the war machine, a city whose heartbeat was the hammering of steel. From the air, the factories glowed like furnaces, casting the light of victory across the night sky. This was not just war, it was industrial warfare. The Axis powers could win battles, but they could not match the storm of production that the Allies unleashed. By 1944, the numbers were beyond comprehension. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of planes, millions of shells and rifles, all built, shipped, and replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Generals fought the battles,
But it was the factories that won the war. The power of industrial warfare reshaped the world and proved that in the modern age, the greatest weapon is the ability to build.
At first, Germany seemed unstoppable. Its tanks blitzed across Europe. Its Luftwaffe ruled the skies. Its factories ran with clockwork precision. The world watched and feared a war machine that appeared invincible. But deep inside the Reich's command, reports began to whisper another truth, a truth that numbers could not hide. While Germany built hundreds, America built thousands. While Berlin repaired, Detroit replaced. And while German engineers fought for quality, America conquered with quantity. Hitler's generals began to notice at first. Every destroyed tank seemed instantly replaced by 3 more. Every bomber lost over Europe was followed by entire new squadrons. Factories in Essen and Hamburg were bombed to rubble. But across the ocean, American plants only expanded. Night shifts never stopped. Assembly lines stretched for miles. The machine never slept. German intelligence agents reported that Ford's River Rouge plant could produce a tank every 25 hours, that new ships were launched faster than old ones could be sunk, that even after devastating losses, America's strength only grew. By 1943, the realization struck hard. Germany could not replace what it lost. Its fuel was running out, its raw materials were thinning, its people were exhausted. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America's arsenal of democracy was still accelerating. German soldiers began seeing it firsthand, fields filled with Shermans, convoys stretching to the horizon, bombers blotting out the sun. The scale was overwhelming. A tidal wave of production rolling endlessly toward Berlin. In the war rooms of the Reich, the truth was undeniable. They were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting an economy, a nation that had turned every hand, every factory, every heartbeat into a weapon. That was the moment Germany realized no matter how fierce its armies, how advanced its weapons, or how loyal its soldiers, it could not keep up with the industrial giant it had awakened.
When the guns finally fell silent, the world looked across the oceans and saw the true victors. Not only the men who fought, but the machines that carried them to victory. The endless columns of Sherman tanks rolling through Europe like a river of steel. The flying fortresses that turned the skies into thunder. The carriers, those floating cities that brought the war to Japan's doorstep. These were not just weapons. They were the proof of an idea that freedom, when united with industry, could outbuild tyranny itself. Every jeep that crossed the Rhine, every bomber that roared over Berlin, every Liberty ship that cut through the Atlantic storm was a triumph of mass production, of ordinary citizens turned engineers of destiny. The machines became symbols of power, of unity, of a nation that refused to slow down until the last battle was won. Germany's engineers once mocked the simplicity, the crudeness of American designs. But that simplicity was genius. It meant fast, cheap, repairable, and unstoppable. The Sherman wasn't perfect, but it was there. Always more of them, always ready. The B-17 wasn't invincible, but it came home on one engine. Its crew alive to fly again. Every bolt, every weld, every rivet was a promise that democracy could fight back with iron and will. And when the Axis fell, the world's factories fell silent again.
But the machines remained, symbols of what humanity could do when united against darkness. The machines that won the war weren't just built of metal. They were built of faith, determination, and the unbreakable spirit of millions who believed that victory was something they could make with their own hands.